You'll notice that I said when we work in a new school, we take at least a term to either consider introducing the school to the local church. Of course, the church has to agree because they might not want to. They might have a heart for something else or whatever it may be. But yeah, we typically give a good period of time before we begin to look to sort of innovate things and examples like that. Yeah, absolutely right. You have to earn your keep within a school. You have to earn the right to do something different, which it would might be, you know, anything to do with the Christian faith. So certainly, one of the reasons I was at my last school for 14 years was because relationships do build over time, and the trust within the pupils, trust in the staff can't be won within a few weeks. So completely agree with all of that. Yes. So these are a few things that are now much more generic and hopefully will help you as you consider school. So just from an educational context, oh, sorry, I've gone forward. As I say, we are dealing with schools on a daily basis. We're speaking to head teachers regularly. We will be sort of pitching our work to head teachers because we want to have more Christians within schools. We're also dealing with head teachers who might come back with questions of all sorts of reasons over the months and years they're in those schools. I'm also a vice chair of governors at a large school here down in Canterbury, so aware of sort of the temperature very much. And by and large, there is a suspicion from education towards faith groups. And I probably should have put a lowercase s because that sounds a little bit over dramatic. But typically speaking, I think one of the issues is that it's not necessarily the head teacher or the deputy head or the chair of governors that you might be able to work with to go into the school. We find that actually there's a sort of a misnomer around this. We think that the media would want us to believe there's a suspicion around faith groups. We do hear of slightly alarmist stories. We do hear of some of the worst case scenarios of I don't know, Christians trying to reach out to schools. We might hear about things that have gone wrong. You won't tend to hear about the 999 positive things that happen because these things go on unrewarded sometimes and without much fanfare. So there would seemingly be a suspicion around faith groups because schools are becoming seemingly more secular. But we need to remember that I don't think there's a head teacher in the country that wouldn't bite your hand off if you were offering them something which was relevant to them. There's obviously an insistence within schools, again, that's media driven of embracing ideologies and practices and things that wouldn't traditionally be supported by the church. And obviously there's a whole range of things there. There's a whole range of different backgrounds and even church positions on different things. But when you look at social media, it's easy to be put off by the fact that, oh, you know, this is all very much the opposite to what the Christian faith teaches. But actually, you know, it is illegal to discriminate against somebody because of their faith. And it's very easy for us to think that benefits everybody else. But actually, we have a lot of rights as Christians. We have a lot of freedom to be able to share the gospel. And if we're wise and diligent with it, we've got a huge platform. Schools are under financial pressure, so therefore they won't be able to complete and put in place their wish list of everything for their children. Most schools won't be able to have a complete full set of staff, and they'll have to merge teachers together across departments. Very, very few schools have a full complement of teaching assistants. That's one of the biggest challenges in the moment. Schools are at the moment guilty of not being able to put on as much extracurricular as they would have done 10, 20 years ago because of the costs that it might incur or the pressure and capacity on teachers. So there's another interesting point for us to consider. We know that head teachers and leaders and school teachers in general are under more pressure than ever. Exam performances and Ofsted performances have much more of a black and white outcome than they would have done when many teachers entered the profession originally. And we have a record number of teachers leaving the profession, a record number. So Although these things might seem like they're doom and gloom, the interesting thing for us is it actually gives us an opportunity as the church to be able to react and fill what is an increasing amount of gaps. So you notice I haven't mentioned sport once here, and hopefully that encourages you. And one obvious example was that when we came back from COVID, as I was making my way from the school to the KICK, I had the gift of being able to do that in my time, because as part of the leadership team and the only Christian on that, and holding the relationships with the local churches, I wasn't going to let that fall away. So I had an extended leave period, which allowed me to put things in place. And one of the things I did was to contact the local churches and just ask them again, what could you do for this school? The head teacher wasn't a Christian, but was very open-minded to anybody from the local community helping his school. We were running at a slight deficit budget, nothing alarming, but the projection was that 3 years' time we would be slightly more in deficit budget, which is very common, by the way, so it wasn't just us. So realistically, it was going to be a case of less rather than more. And that is the case in the majority of schools, wherever you are. The schools around you would likely be running at a deficit budget or heading towards one if they don't make cuts. So within all of these things, we need to remember to not be too swayed by media, by social media chat or suggestions or scaremongering stories, because of course we're wise and we're prayerful about the steps we take and the conversations we had. But as the church, we know that the schools are crying out for help. There's all sorts of opportunities. And if I go on to here, before we talk about some examples, I wanted just to consider some of the things that a school would value. And you notice I've got character traits here rather than actual things or jobs. First and foremost, it would be consistency. So one of the things that I put in place at the school I was leaving, it was a very nominal Church of England school. So clearly there is more scope for discussion around the Christian faith. And without going into it too much, the word nominal hopefully will give you a clue. And the fact that I was the only member of staff that was a Christian, again, would sort of give you a temperature of things. But what I did was I reached out to the Canterbury area and went to 4 particular churches. And what was lovely was that there was 4 different denominations: St Mary's, which was the Church of England church. There was Vineyard Church, there was a New Frontier Church, and also the City, Barton Church as well, which was an evangelical free. And I reached out to them and said, what do you think you could do for this school? And their first answer was like, oh, well, you must be talking to me and thinking of me, I'm the pastor, that must be me. With all these churches, they had a plethora of people of different ages, backgrounds, skill sets and talents. And I said, no, I'm not really talking necessarily to you as the church leader. What about people in your congregation that have maybe recently retired and have more time on their hands, or people that might work part-time and have some flexibility, some availability? But crucially, whatever you offer a school has to be consistent. Schools are disproportionately anxious about lack of consistency. And one of my jobs as vice chair of governors at a primary school is trying to sort of manage upwards to the head, who's brilliant, but say to him, don't be too worried if sometimes we have to sort of be a little bit agile, because particularly with primary schools, they're very anxious about a lack of consistency. So if somebody doesn't arrive to deliver something, of course, that's poor, and that will lose confidence straight away. So consistency, flexibility. With these guys, we put different things in place, but I said that whatever it is might change after a month. So if Jim, literally Jim, who came from the Vineyard Church and did some after school stuff, I said, if things change and there begins to become issues with the year 8s that weren't there before, or a member of staff leaves unexpectedly and there's some sort of gap, or there's something that they need, be ready to be flexible to what the school want. Thirdly, to be adaptable. And, you know, schools can sometimes seemingly be quite complex places, maybe even intimidating if you haven't been in them before, but it's about being adaptable because young people have got so many different needs. And it's only really once we're in the school that we know what the mission is going to be. You might go in with an intention of doing something, and that might change when you're in there very quickly. So Paul and Chris, who came on board from the City Church, which is the New Frontiers Church I spoke to, came on board because I asked them to help with pastoral care in the sixth form. Because the head of sixth form, which was me previously, was very young, well, relatively young, and I knew how complex pastoral needs of 17 and 18-year-olds could be. So I asked them, they were recently retired, probably 2 or 3 years, and they're very pastoral minded people, have a heart particularly for schools. And they went straight in and once a week spent 1/2 a day within the sixth form, typically starting with being with the head of sixth form first, whilst he began to introduce them more and more. When I went in after the first half term of leaving to join KICK to visit, Chris and Paul shared with me just how much time they'd spent with the head teacher, David. And Paul in particular had become a real confidant for David. If you're a head teacher, you don't necessarily want to share with your leadership team your concerns all the time. You might not want to admit your concerns to your chair of governors because he has the power to potentially remove you from your role. And whilst there was nothing particularly heavy at that point, Paul had become a real ear for Dave, a shoulder to lean on, whatever the phrase might be. I've things muddled up. But I didn't bring him in as a support for the head teacher. That would have been extremely risky on my part to suggest to the head teacher that I need to line someone up for him. But rather, that role moulded wonderfully well. And Dave was not a Christian, but he's now got a very, very close relationship with Paul, who does go in to serve the sixth form as and when. But I know has conversation after conversation after conversation about life, about the Christian faith, about the philosophies of the school, all because Paul offered to go in and potentially be an ear to the sixth form. He's now got the ear of the head teacher of a large school. So that's just an encouragement for you to be adaptable when you're in there. And lastly, what a school would want. And I know this sounds boring, but you have to treat teachers a bit like children at times, because we've gone to school, gone to university and gone back to school again. So a lot of us don't really grow up very much. They really want people that are quite low risk and a steady pair of hands. And it's quite different to anyone that's worked in business or any other walk of life. There's not that much room for innovation or risk taking, I'm afraid, because there's a disproportionate knock-on effect of things going wrong, and it's the children that suffer, which of course is a risk that we can't take. So we need to present ourselves as consistent, and we must not ever, we will lose all traction if that becomes an issue. Before we make any steps, we need to make sure that we will be. We want to be flexible because we might find we're being asked to do something we don't necessarily feel that we're skilled to do, but that might be the only opening. We want to be adaptable because when we're in there, the Lord will potentially draw us to all sorts of different people. And we also need to be relatively seen as low risk and a really steady pair of hands. Head teachers are balancing a lot of plates, spinning a lot of plates, and they really don't want to have any complications with anybody that's coming in and helping. So on the flip side, before I give you some examples of that, what don't they want? And as we were sharing earlier, we mustn't do too much too soon, and we need to be in a school for a period of time before we begin to do anything which could be potentially divisive or questionable. And of course, we know that from experience. So firstly, innovation without permission is a no-no. So if we've been asked to come in to do something in particular, we need to be very careful before we ad hoc, deviate even slightly. We need to make sure that we stick very much on task and very much to what's been agreed. Schools value familiarity, and they wouldn't really want somebody coming in to work with a local church if they have a different person each week. They'd much rather the same faces. Even if you think there's somebody wonderfully talented within your church that can do all these great things, young people, but they're only available occasionally, a school would rather somebody that is available regularly, who potentially isn't necessarily as talented, but is there all the time. Children, people will tell us that children need to be wowed by all sorts of gimmicks and all sorts of fashion things. It's a nonsense, really. If somebody is consistent in their lives and somebody is there all the time and intentional and is always there for them, over time, that will breed a depth of relationship that goes far beyond the wow factor that age or fashion might bring. And it's the same with staff. Staff are used to external agencies coming in just to earn money, deliver sport, deliver something, going again. What they're not used to are volunteers coming on a regular basis and selflessly giving their time. And that really is what a school does want. So not too much too soon. Don't keep chopping and changing the volunteers. And we have to be very careful not to be seen to have a different agenda or hidden agenda. If we need to be as open as transparent with the school as we can. It would be wrong of us to pretend we're not Christians or to say we're never going to talk about our Christian faith. But we want to sort of, thrash these things out quite early and make sure that we don't be seen of having a different agenda. We want to be seen as servants first and foremost, and that will open doors for us. So what I'd like to do is just for 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to put these on the board. I will come back to it in a moment, but could you just in a 3 take a couple of minutes to talk about any examples of anything you've done with a school or someone you worked with or the organization you worked with have done with the school on a voluntary basis and how that went? Was it successful? Not so much. And maybe you can present one thing that failed and one thing that went well. And I'll speak to you in a couple of minutes. Thank you. So great that you're talking, guys, and hopefully you're encouraging each other and having a chance to bounce ideas. So some things that you can typically offer when we are seeking wherever possible to introduce a church to the school that we're in, these are the conversations that will often come up. So we don't go wading in on the first day and say to the school that we're delivering PE, oh, by the way, you really need to get to know the local church. There's 4 of us on the exec, 3 of us have been school leaders. We realise that relationships take time and trust needs to be built. So what we'll do is after a suitable time when we feel like the relationship's solid, we will begin to talk about friends that we have. I've introduced a number of our schools to Good News for Everyone, used to be known as the Gideons, and we've given out 1,600 Bibles in the last 2 years on their behalf in schools that they are not getting responses from. I'm in a process at the moment where I'm working with Youth for Christ and mapping their centres against where our schools are. And there's all sorts of, leverage around organisational processes that you could use that are already existing. Could you be a conduit between an organisation and a school? That would be a big question for you. Extracurricular activities are the most common thing that people will ask for. EAL, we have particularly here in the south of England an increasing need for young people who don't speak English to be given some support, and that comes up when head teachers ask about our connections with churches and possible voluntary work. RE lessons on Christianity is actually very, very well received because they would consider, I did look after an RE department for a whole year before coming out of education due to ill health and have a theology degree and other things along that lines. So I was shoehorned in. The local schools are very keen on local faith groups coming in and sharing about their religion. It ticks Ofsted boxes because there are specific curriculum boxes around external educational providers and real life experience. So RE lessons are a big tick with nearly all schools. Tutoring and mentoring would be 2 things that will often come up because every school will want more. There was a huge amount of money pumped into post-COVID support, and that has run out very quickly. So there won't be a school in the land that don't want people to do these things. Assemblies, teachers are always looking to give this one up. So anything you could provide will be accepted. And lastly, sports activities as well. And one of the things you can consider about sport activities, which is what we do actually encourage, despite the fact most of us are PTs from young, is why not say to the school, have you got young people who are struggling at the moment, who are school refusers, or who are having to benefit from the use of a counsellor or mentor? Are there, don't necessarily reach out to the hurly-burly boys to do football. Is there something much more passive you can do with pupils who are struggling and use it as a mentoring opportunity? Table tennis would be just as beneficial, if not more. We're not necessarily looking at being the new football manager. So that would make the path inwards much more accessible. And lastly, I think it would just be necessary to consider all of the things I've just said would need to come with time and capacity. What could you offer? When would you offer it? And what is the ability to offer it for the medium to long term? If we know that relationship and trust will build over the long term, how can we make sure that we have a plan in place? And the key question then would be, and this is for you to consider, how can we begin to overtly at the right time and with God's wisdom begin to share the Christian faith? Now, that might not be you, it might be you as a conduit. You might be just there to build the bridge for you to be able to introduce somebody else to the school. You might be the person that it brings somebody else from the church within to the school to do another activity which might be more overtly Christian. So I think we're going to run out of time, but the homework, I suppose, or the consideration over coffee would be, with all the different examples we have and with all the considerations and the character traits that head teachers want within the social conditions that we're in, how can we begin over time to begin to use our service to lead to opportunities for young people to come to know more about the Christian faith? So I think, Sean, because you're standing up, that must be my signal to stop.
Yeah.
Apologies, it's been so much of me. It's been a bit weird not being able to see everybody. Otherwise, it's been much more conversational, but very, very happy to follow on the conversation and share ideas with people further if they wish. But otherwise, thank you for your time and wish you a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Mark.